In the sweltering heat of late September 1906, Atlanta, Georgia, a city often described as bustling and industrious, became the stage for one of the most shocking chapters in American history. On the 22nd of that month, an enormous crowd of white citizens poured into the downtown streets, driven by fear, anger, and prejudice. What began as whispered rumors and sensationalized newspaper reports quickly erupted into a wave of violence that targeted African American communities, their homes, and their businesses. The scene was chaotic and terrifying. Streets that had once been filled with the lively chatter of vendors, children playing, and workers hurrying to their jobs became a theater of destruction. Windows shattered, shops were looted, and entire blocks were engulfed in panic. Families fled for their lives, seeking shelter wherever they could, while others were trapped, facing unimaginable danger. This was not a spontaneous outburst of frustration, it was a storm fueled by years of tension, misunderstanding, and manipulation. Atlanta's African American population had grown significantly by the early 20th century, establishing prosperous businesses, social networks, and vibrant neighborhoods. Black barbers, shopkeepers, and professionals were carving out a place in a city that was still struggling with the legacies of slavery and segregation. Their success, however, was met with resentment from some white residents who feared losing social and economic control. This fear was stoked by newspapers and political figures who deliberately spread stories that exaggerated crimes and cast the African American community in a threatening light. As the mob surged through the streets, the violence was indiscriminate. Individuals who had done nothing more than exist in spaces of economic and social progress were attacked. Shops were ransacked, personal belongings stolen or destroyed, and countless acts of physical assault left the community reeling. The terror did not remain confined to a single street or neighborhood, it spread like wildfire. A reminder of how deeply prejudice and fear can undermine humanity. Amid this turmoil, stories of courage and resilience emerged. Many African Americans defended their homes, organized with neighbors, and sought refuge in churches and other safe spaces. These acts of bravery, though often overshadowed by the overwhelming chaos, showcased a determination to survive and protect one's community in the face of extraordinary adversity. Today, as we recount these events, it is crucial to understand both the historical context and the human experiences within it. The 1906 Atlanta events were not merely a series of violent encounters, they were reflections of systemic inequalities, the power of media narratives, and the struggles for civil rights and recognition. By remembering this past, we not only honor the victims but also gain insight into the ongoing challenges of justice and equality. If you want to explore more stories that uncover hidden chapters of history, highlight resilience, and offer lessons for today, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us continue sharing these important narratives and ensures that these stories reach more viewers, keeping history alive and relevant for generations to come. As the sun rose over Atlanta on September 22, 1906, the city awoke not to its usual rhythm of bustling streets and market chatter, but to an unfolding nightmare that would grip the community for 4 harrowing days. What began in the heart of downtown, particularly around the busy 5 Points intersection where commerce and daily life intertwined, quickly expanded into a wave of chaos that swept through the surrounding black neighborhoods, including the vibrant community of Brownsville. The violence, fueled by a volatile mix of fear, prejudice, and manipulation, was relentless, transforming familiar streets into scenes of terror and uncertainty. Families who had once walked these avenues with confidence now moved with caution, peering through windows and locking doors as the shadows of mobs stretched across the city. The intensity of the unrest escalated with each passing hour. From the initial confrontations downtown, groups of men, emboldened by rumors and inflammatory reports, moved outward, targeting residential areas, shops, and communal spaces. In Brownsville, a neighborhood known for its tightly knit community and thriving businesses, the residents faced the sudden intrusion of hostile crowds that showed little regard for life or property. Homes that had stood for decades, filled with generations of memories and achievements, were invaded and damaged. Stores that had been sources of livelihood and pride were vandalized, their contents looted or destroyed. The sounds of shattering glass, shouted commands, and frantic cries echoed through the streets, creating an atmosphere of fear that seemed to settle over the city like a dense fog. Amid this turmoil, the responses of those being targeted reflected both courage and desperation. Many families sought shelter wherever possible, moving quickly from street to street, often finding safety only in the protective walls of churches, schools, or the occasional sympathetic neighbor. Some community members, understanding that survival required action, took up arms to defend their homes and families, creating tense standoffs that underscored the community's resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. The courage displayed in these moments, though often overshadowed by the scale of the violence, highlighted a determination to protect one's dignity, property, and life, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The unrest was not confined to physical spaces. It reverberated through the social and economic fabric of Atlanta. Black business owners, who had worked tirelessly to build their livelihoods, found themselves at the mercy of an unchecked mob, witnessing years of labor reduced to ruins in mere hours. The psychological toll was immense, as fear and uncertainty infiltrated daily life, eroding the sense of security that the community had fought so hard to establish in a city that had become home. For children, the experience was formative and terrifying, shaping memories that would linger long after the streets were cleared and the mobs dispersed. Witnessing friends and family attacked, hearing the distant cries of neighbors in peril, and seeing familiar landmarks desecrated created a lasting imprint, reminding all that safety and stability could never be taken for granted. Throughout the 4 days, the movement of the mobs revealed both the strategic spread of intimidation and the arbitrary nature of the attacks. No neighborhood seemed safe, as groups swept from the commercial heart of the city into residential areas, targeting anyone perceived as a threat or simply as a representative of a growing black presence in Atlanta. Brownsville, with its concentration of families, churches, and businesses, became a focal point of resistance and confrontation, a stark illustration of the courage of those who refused to flee entirely and the determination of those seeking to suppress their community. The streets bore witness to moments of heroism and tragedy alike, with individuals making split-second decisions to protect loved ones or risking everything to shield others from harm. As the final day, September 25th, drew to a close, the physical and emotional landscape of the city had been irrevocably altered. Streets were scarred, homes damaged, and businesses decimated, but the resilience of the community persisted. Though the violence had been intense and widespread, the collective response of those affected through acts of courage, solidarity, and self-preservation illuminated a determination to endure and rebuild. The events of those 4 days left an indelible mark on Atlanta's history, revealing not only the destructive power of fear and prejudice, but also the strength and fortitude of a community confronting adversity. In recounting these events, it becomes clear that the Atlanta unrest of 1906 was far more than a fleeting incident. It was a prolonged trial of human spirit, morality, and societal structures, a moment when the city's ideals and realities collided violently. By understanding the scope of these 4 days, from the central streets of 5 Points to the residential neighborhoods of Brownsville, we gain insight into the broader patterns of systemic oppression, the consequences of unchecked rumor and fear, and the enduring courage of those who faced unimaginable danger with dignity and resolve, leaving a legacy that continues to inform the struggle for justice and equality today. In the tense days leading up to the outbreak of violence in Atlanta, the city's newspapers played a decisive and destructive role, shaping the fears and perceptions that would ultimately ignite chaos in the streets. Headlines screamed with sensational claims, asserting that African American men had attacked white women, exaggerating isolated incidents into a narrative of widespread threat and danger. The stories were often unverified or deliberately distorted, designed not to inform but to provoke a response, to stoke the anxieties of a population already uneasy about social changes and the rising prominence of the black community in the city's economic and political life. As these articles circulated through the city, they became catalysts, inflaming passions and creating an atmosphere where suspicion and prejudice merged with opportunity for violence. The impact of these reports extended far beyond the ink on the page. Families gathered around breakfast tables and newsstands, absorbing details that painted entire neighborhoods as dangerous and menacing, internalizing warnings that transformed everyday spaces into imagined battlegrounds. Men read with growing indignation, their fears reinforced by the idea that their safety, their honor, and their very way of life were under attack. Women, too, were drawn into the web of anxiety, hearing tales of assaults and imagining loved ones imperiled. While children, though often shielded from the full scope of the news, felt the tension in whispered conversations and hurried movements. This flood of information, manipulated and weaponized, prepared the ground for the mobs that would soon surge into the streets, giving moral justification to actions that would otherwise be unconscionable. Political currents ran parallel to this manipulation of media. The gubernatorial race of 1906, marked by fierce competition between candidates, saw newspapers act not only as observers but as active participants, amplifying racial anxieties to influence the electorate. Reports of alleged crimes by black men were not neutral accounts. They were selective, strategically framed to suggest that the stability and security of white citizens depended on immediate action, creating a sense of urgency that blurred the line between perception and reality. By portraying the African American community as a collective threat, these stories provided the pretext for aggression, encouraging readers to internalize a narrative in which violence became a response to necessity rather than an act of cruelty. The interplay of politics, media, and social tension created a feedback loop, each element reinforcing the other, escalating fears and magnifying the sense of crisis. As the reports reached a crescendo in the days surrounding September 22nd, the impact on downtown Atlanta was immediate and tangible. Crowds began to gather, initially in small groups, murmuring and debating the reports they had read, then growing in size and intensity as the day progressed. The line between reality and rumor blurred, with each new edition of the paper serving as both evidence and provocation. What had begun as words on a page became a lived experience as mobs moved into the streets, their actions framed in their own minds as protective and justified. A response to a threat constructed largely through sensational journalism. The violence that followed was, in part, a consequence of the narrative spun in these newspapers, as fear became tangible and collective, translating into destructive energy that engulfed neighborhoods and businesses alike. The consequences of this media-fueled hysteria were profound and enduring. Beyond the immediate devastation of property and the tragic loss of life, the false reports shaped historical memory, influencing how events were understood both at the time and in the decades that followed. Communities were destabilized, trust eroded, and the social fabric of Atlanta was frayed by a combination of rumor, sensational reporting, and long-standing prejudices. For those living through the events, Newspapers were not neutral observers, but active participants in a drama that turned neighbors into enemies and streets into theaters of fear. Yet even in the midst of this manipulation and chaos, the African American community displayed remarkable resilience, organizing for safety, protecting families, and enduring assaults with dignity, their courage standing in stark contrast to the manufactured hysteria that had swept through the city. Reflecting on this episode, it becomes clear how powerfully words can shape actions and perceptions, how media narratives, when unchecked or deliberately distorted, can justify cruelty and amplify injustice. The Atlanta events of 1906 illustrate the devastating potential of rumor and fear when amplified by the press, showing that violence often arises not merely from spontaneous emotion but from deliberate, structured, and persuasive storytelling. Understanding this dynamic allows us to see the events of that September not only as a tragic moment in history, but also as a cautionary tale, emphasizing the responsibility inherent in reporting, the fragility of trust, and the enduring importance of critical engagement with the stories we consume and share. In the tense atmosphere of Atlanta in 1906, the city's political landscape was as volatile as the streets themselves, and the gubernatorial race that year became an instrument that fanned the flames of existing fears and prejudices. Clark Howell and Hoke Smith, the two prominent candidates vying for the Democratic nomination, understood the anxieties that permeated the white community, anxieties rooted in economic competition, social change, and the increasing visibility of African Americans in political and civic life. Rather than seeking to calm tensions or promote equitable governance, both campaigns capitalized on these fears, using racial narratives as a tool to galvanize support and influence voters. Newspapers affiliated with the candidates amplified stories of alleged crimes and moral transgressions, painting African American men as a looming threat to the social order and suggesting that the protection of white families and property depended upon immediate political action. This strategic manipulation of public perception was not incidental but carefully orchestrated. Campaign speeches, editorials, and advertisements worked in tandem to convey the message that the stakes of the election extended beyond typical political concerns. They implied that the very safety and supremacy of white citizens were at risk if the candidates' visions were not adopted. By framing the election in terms of existential threat, both Howell and Smith created a climate in which anxiety could translate directly into votes, and in doing so, laid the groundwork for the violent events that would soon erupt in the city's streets. The rhetoric of fear became a powerful catalyst, transforming political competition into a lever for social control and, ultimately, a justification for aggression against a community that had long been seeking recognition and equality. The consequences of this fear-mongering were immediate and tangible. As reports circulated about alleged assaults and the supposed dangers posed by African Americans, crowds began to gather, emboldened by the sense that they were acting in defense of their city and families. What had started as political maneuvering became a combustible mixture of rumor, resentment, and historical grievances, erupting into mob violence that would sweep through downtown Atlanta and beyond. The tension between economic competition and social hierarchies, white workers wary of black advancement, white elites anxious to maintain political control, was reframed by political narratives as a matter of survival. And this framing turned citizens into actors in a drama of violence that extended far beyond electoral concerns. Within this environment, the African American community faced a precarious reality. Black citizens who had established businesses, contributed to civic life, and exercised their right to vote found themselves portrayed as threats rather than neighbors or colleagues. This distortion, driven by political ambition and amplified through newspapers and speeches, reinforced a sense of otherness and justified acts that in any normal circumstance would have been unthinkable. Families prepared for the worst, neighborhood watch groups organized defenses, and individuals took extraordinary precautions to protect their homes and loved ones. The tension in the air was palpable, a combination of uncertainty and dread that permeated every corner of the city as the election approached. As the political rhetoric reached its peak, the city became a tinderbox. Each report of an alleged incident, each editorial invoking fear of black political power, and each campaign speech warning of social upheaval contributed to a narrative that made violence appear not only inevitable but necessary. Downtown streets, once spaces of commerce and exchange, became arenas in which citizens acted out the anxieties that had been cultivated by the very political system meant to govern them. The mobs that formed were not spontaneous in the sense of being unconnected to larger forces. They were a direct product of a political climate that had normalized suspicion and mistrust, rendering aggression into a socially sanctioned response to fear. The aftermath of the election and the violence that accompanied it revealed the profound consequences of using racial fear as a political tool. Entire communities were destabilized, lives were lost, and the city's social and economic fabric was left in tatters. Beyond the immediate destruction, the events underscored how political ambitions, when intertwined with systemic prejudice and media amplification, could produce real-world harm that extended far beyond the ballot box. African Americans in Atlanta were forced to navigate a reality in which their existence, success, and political participation were cast as threats, highlighting the persistent challenges of equity and justice in a society where power and fear were deeply intertwined. Reflecting on this moment, it becomes evident that the 1906 gubernatorial race was not merely a contest of ideas or policies, but a decisive force in shaping social behavior and community dynamics. By weaponizing fear, the candidates set in motion a chain of events that culminated in tragedy, illustrating how political rhetoric can extend its influence beyond discourse into the lived experiences of individuals and communities. Understanding this connection allows us to see the Atlanta events of 1906 not only as a historical incident of violence, but also as a cautionary tale about the power of political narratives, the responsibilities of leadership, and the fragile boundary between persuasion and manipulation in times of social tension. By the early 1900s, Atlanta had become a city of transformation and contrast, a place where opportunity drew individuals from rural areas and small towns, swelling its population and infusing the city with energy and ambition. Amid this growth, the African American community was making remarkable strides, establishing businesses, engaging in civic life, and asserting political influence in ways that challenged long-standing hierarchies. Prosperous black entrepreneurs opened shops, barber parlors, and other enterprises that served both black and white clientele, generating wealth and contributing to the city's economy in visible and meaningful ways. The achievements of these individuals, however, did not go unnoticed by white residents, many of whom felt a mounting unease as traditional social and economic structures were called into question. Economic competition became a focal point of tension, particularly as black laborers and business owners entered markets that had previously been dominated by white workers. Wages, opportunities for advancement, and access to profitable ventures increasingly included African Americans, and some white residents interpreted this progress as a direct threat to their status and security. For decades, the idea of racial hierarchy had gone largely unquestioned, and the visible success of black citizens challenged the assumptions underpinning that hierarchy, stirring resentment and fueling anxieties about social mobility and economic displacement. The presence of thriving black-owned businesses, which often served as hubs of community life, amplified these feelings, transforming achievement into a perceived provocation. Political empowerment further intensified these dynamics. During Reconstruction and in the years that followed, African Americans in Atlanta had gained the right to vote, and many exercised that franchise with determination and strategic purpose, aligning with parties and candidates that promised representation and protection of their interests. By 1906, black voters constituted a significant portion of the Republican base in the city, a reality that white political leaders and citizens found alarming. the notion that African Americans could influence elections, shape policy, and assert their voices in civic matters struck at the core of long-standing fears about the erosion of white dominance. Campaign rhetoric, especially from Democratic candidates in the gubernatorial race, capitalized on these anxieties, portraying black political activity as a threat that necessitated immediate action, thereby intertwining fear with the pursuit of political gain. Demographic growth added yet another layer to the rising tensions. Atlanta's black population had grown significantly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, fueled by migration from surrounding rural areas and smaller towns. Neighborhoods expanded, and communities that had once been small and relatively insular now had greater visibility and influence, both socially and economically. White residents who had long considered certain areas as theirs to occupy exclusively now found themselves sharing streets, markets, and public spaces with a growing black population, leading to friction that was magnified by media narratives and political agitation. The demographic shift was more than a numerical change. It represented a visible assertion of presence, a challenge to assumptions of cultural and social dominance that some whites were unwilling to accept. The intersection of economic success, political influence, and demographic change created a volatile mix. Prosperous African Americans were seen not merely as neighbors or competitors, but as embodiments of a broader challenge to the status quo. And their achievements were interpreted through a lens of fear and prejudice. Businesses became symbolic battlegrounds, their owners targets of both verbal attacks and physical aggression, while neighborhoods where black residents had established roots were scrutinized with suspicion. The combination of economic visibility and political agency made the African American community a focal point for anxieties that were stoked by newspapers, political campaigns, and social gossip, feeding a narrative that framed progress as threat. Amid this growing resentment, ordinary life for black Atlantans became fraught with tension. Walking through the city streets, visiting markets, or operating businesses was no longer just a matter of daily routine, but an act performed under the scrutiny of those who viewed success and agency with hostility. Families navigated a landscape in which the very achievements that should have been celebrated became sources of danger, as mobs and hostile individuals interpreted visibility and accomplishment as provocation. Community networks, churches, and social organizations became critical in providing support, guidance, and protection, reflecting resilience and solidarity in the face of increasing uncertainty. As the events of September 1906 unfolded, these underlying resentments manifested with devastating intensity. The violence that erupted in 5 Points and spread to neighborhoods like Brownsville was not simply a spontaneous reaction. It was the culmination of years of economic competition, political assertion, and demographic change that had unsettled the city's white population. The conflation of fear, prejudice, and opportunity to assert power created a situation where mob action was framed as justified defense, a tragic misinterpretation of ambition and survival. By examining the role of economic, political, and demographic factors, we see how deeply structural inequalities and social anxieties can shape behavior, illustrating that the Atlanta unrest was as much a story of fear and perception as it was of physical violence. Understanding this context allows for a fuller comprehension of the 1906 events, showing that the city's transformation, while promising and dynamic, also exposed fault lines of tension and resistance. The successes of the African American community, rather than being celebrated as contributions to the city's vitality, were viewed by many as a challenge to an entrenched social order, highlighting the complex interplay between progress, fear, and systemic bias that continues to inform discussions of social justice and equity today. As the tensions that had been simmering in Atlanta for months finally erupted into open violence, The city streets became a theater of terror, and what had been fears and rumors transformed into horrifying reality. The mobs that had gathered were not small or disorganized. They were thousands strong, moving with an almost coordinated intent, propelled by the conviction that they were defending their homes and communities from a threat that had been meticulously constructed through newspapers, political rhetoric, and social anxieties. These men roamed through the city, their presence both intimidating and destructive. Eyes scanning the streets for targets, voices calling out warnings and commands, a collective force fueled by fear, resentment, and a sense of entitlement to power and dominance. The violence began in the heart of downtown, around the Five Points district, an area where commerce thrived and black-owned businesses were concentrated. Streetcars, the arteries of the city's daily life, became deadly zones as white mobs pulled black passengers from vehicles, subjecting them to brutal attacks that left many dead or grievously wounded. Those who had hoped for a normal commute or a safe passage through the city found themselves in unimaginable danger, caught in a wave of violence that was indiscriminate and relentless. As mobs surged from street to street, they invaded homes, chased individuals from their workplaces, and targeted anyone who was visible as African American, turning familiar neighborhoods into places of fear and flight. The methods of violence were horrifying in their variety and intensity. Stabbings, shootings, and lynchings were carried out in public, acts that sent chilling messages to the broader black community about the consequences of visibility and success. Business owners who had invested years of labor into establishing their livelihoods saw them destroyed almost overnight, their shops looted, smashed, and set ablaze, erasing not only wealth but the symbolic progress they represented. Families sought refuge wherever they could. In hospitals, in churches, in the homes of neighbors. Yet the mob often tracked them, ensuring that no sanctuary was entirely safe. Children and the elderly were not spared, and even those who had no connection to alleged provocations were subjected to terror simply for being present, illustrating the indiscriminate and collective nature of the attacks. The city's infrastructure, which had been designed for commerce and convenience, became a tool of oppression. Trolley lines were shut down in attempts to limit movement, yet the mobs adapted, spreading into surrounding neighborhoods and continuing their assaults with a relentless determination. Public spaces that had once been neutral or welcoming, from sidewalks to parks, became zones of life-threatening danger, where a misstep could result in injury or death. The scale of the violence was staggering, with estimates of deaths and injuries rising by the hour, though records remained incomplete as the chaos outpaced any capacity for documentation. Witnesses later described the scenes as surreal, with the air filled with shouts, gunfire, and the cries of the injured, and the streets littered with broken glass, debris, and the remnants of lives interrupted. Amid the terror, the responses of city authorities were inconsistent at best and complicit at worst. Police and militia were deployed, but often their presence did not protect the intended victims and, in some cases, appeared to embolden the perpetrators. Arrests of African Americans who sought to defend themselves contrasted sharply with the lack of action against white attackers, reinforcing a brutal message about the imbalance of power and the social sanctioning of violence. Hospitals became overcrowded, makeshift clinics were set up in local buildings, and families clung to one another in fear, relying on the courage and solidarity of neighbors to survive the onslaught. The combination of widespread participation in the violence and institutional failure to intervene amplified the sense of vulnerability and helplessness that permeated the African American community. Personal stories from this period reveal the human cost beyond statistics and newspaper accounts. Individuals like Milton Brown, who was chased down, shot multiple times, and left to die despite the presence of authorities, exemplify the cruel randomness and the targeted aggression of the mobs. Families were torn apart in moments, loved ones lost to sudden acts of brutality, and survivors carried the physical and psychological scars of encounters that had no justification other than racial hatred. The attacks extended over several days, creating a sustained climate of fear that prevented normal life from continuing and forced residents into protective measures that altered the rhythm of the entire city. The terror of the streets during those 4 days illustrates the devastating consequences of fear, prejudice, and systemic complicity converging in a moment of crisis. It shows how rumors, political manipulation, and economic resentment can erupt into large-scale violence when fueled by collective action and the perception of moral justification. Yet it also reveals the resilience and determination of those targeted, who sought safety, provided aid to one another, and survived despite overwhelming odds. The events stand as a somber reminder of the destructive power of unchecked hatred and the critical importance of historical reflection, civic responsibility, and community solidarity in preventing such tragedies from repeating themselves. Among the countless individuals affected by the violence that swept through Atlanta in September 1906, the stories of William Welch, Frank Smith, Annie Shepherd, and many others stand out as tragic testaments to the human cost of fear, prejudice, and orchestrated aggression. William Welch, a barber whose shop had served the community faithfully for years, became a target not because of any wrongdoing, but because his success and visibility symbolized the very progress that white mobs had been incited to fear. On that fateful day, Welch was attacked, his life violently cut short in a manner that underscored the indiscriminate and brutal nature of the assaults. His death was not just a personal loss to those who knew him, but a stark example of how professional achievement could provoke lethal hostility in a society structured around racial hierarchy and resentment. Similarly, Frank Smith, a Western Union messenger, found himself in the crosshairs of a mob that viewed ordinary work and routine presence as grounds for extreme violence, tasked with carrying messages and maintaining communication across the city. Smith's role, which might have seemed mundane in another context, rendered him conspicuous and vulnerable in the eyes of those swept up in the frenzy of mob action. His assault, which involved both stabbing and the cruel use of thrown stones, reflected the randomness and the intensity of the aggression, illustrating how public spaces could transform into arenas of life-threatening danger. Like Welch, Smith's story reveals the tragic intersection of occupational visibility, racial animus, and collective panic, showing how ordinary citizens became victims in a conflagration orchestrated by fear and prejudice. Annie Shepherd, a laundress, experienced the violence from the perspective of those who performed essential, everyday labor, work that under normal circumstances sustained households and communities but, in this context, offered no protection from racialized aggression. Shepherd was shot at close range, her life taken in a moment that captured the terror that permeated even the most routine of tasks. Her story, like those of Welch and Smith, highlights the indiscriminate nature of the violence. Women, and even children, were subjected to attacks simply for being present in a city that had been rendered dangerous by orchestrated fears and societal tensions. In homes, workplaces, and on the streets, African Americans confronted a reality in which normalcy had been replaced by constant vigilance, where the acts of daily life could transform into moments of mortal risk. Beyond these named individuals, countless others, many unnamed, their stories unrecorded, suffered similar fates, their experiences forming a collective narrative of loss and survival. Families were torn apart, children witnessed unimaginable acts of cruelty, and neighbors struggled to shield one another from the chaos that engulfed their streets. The scale of the violence ensured that almost every African American in the affected areas knew someone who had been attacked, creating a pervasive climate of fear and grief. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded. Homes were abandoned in panic. And the city itself seemed to teeter between order and anarchy as mobs roamed, executing acts of brutality that were often witnessed but seldom restrained. In recounting these individual stories, one sees the convergence of multiple forces that made such violence possible. The racialized media narratives that portrayed black citizens as threats, the political campaigns that manipulated fear for electoral gain, and the social resentments fueled by economic competition and demographic change. Each victim, whether named or unnamed, existed at the intersection of these pressures, and their lives became casualties of a broader societal failure to recognize shared humanity over constructed divisions. The targeting of individuals like Welch, Smith, and Shepard demonstrates how fear, once amplified and sanctioned by authority figures or social norms, can manifest in devastating, personal, and immediate ways, translating abstract prejudice into concrete suffering. Yet even amid this darkness, the responses of the community reveal resilience and courage. Families sought shelter wherever possible. Neighbors assisted those in distress, and acts of solidarity provided some measure of comfort and safety. Even as the violence continued unabated, the stories of the victims also serve to humanize the historical record, ensuring that the abstract statistics of death and injury are understood in terms of real people with lives, ambitions, and connections, all of which were disrupted or ended by the mob's actions. Remembering these individuals allows us to grasp the tangible consequences of systemic racism and mass violence, highlighting not only the destructive capacity of fear but also the necessity of vigilance, advocacy, and community support in the face of injustice. The legacies of William Welch, Frank Smith, Annie Shepard, and the many unnamed victims extend beyond their deaths, serving as reminders of both the human cost of orchestrated racial hostility and the importance of preserving historical memory. Their lives illustrate how everyday existence working, serving a community, pursuing personal advancement could be transformed into vulnerability when society normalized inequality and condoned violence. As we recount these stories today, they challenge us to recognize the enduring impact of structural prejudice, to honor the resilience of those who survived, and to reflect on the collective responsibility to prevent such tragedies in the future. As the violence that had engulfed Atlanta reached its peak, the black residents of the city faced a dire choice: flee and abandon their homes, businesses, and communities to the merciless mobs, or take up arms to protect themselves, their families, and their neighborhoods from total annihilation. For many, the decision to defend what they had built was not made lightly, for arming oneself in a city governed by restrictive laws and subjected to systemic prejudice carried immense risk. Yet the alternative, passive submission in the face of an escalating storm of violence, was unimaginable. In neighborhoods like Brownsville, a community that had already witnessed attacks on families, homes, and local businesses, residents gathered whatever weapons they could access, prepared to resist the incursions of the white mobs that had roamed the streets for days, leaving devastation in their wake. The confrontation that ensued was intense and chaotic, a mixture of desperation and determination that reflected both the courage and the peril of standing against overwhelming odds. Residents fired in defense, not as aggressors but as individuals defending their very right to exist. Their actions a visceral response to the terror that had transformed familiar streets into battlegrounds. Reports from the time describe the tension and confusion, with exchanges of gunfire echoing through narrow streets and alleyways. Moments where the fight for survival blurred into a haze of fear, courage, and uncertainty. The shootout became a flashpoint in the broader upheaval, drawing attention from authorities who had largely been absent during the initial wave of attacks, and marking a moment when black residents' agency directly challenged the unchecked power of the mobs. In response to the armed resistance, law enforcement and militia forces moved decisively, though not necessarily impartially. Over 250 black men were arrested, rounded up under armed guard, and placed on streetcars to be transported to jails that were supposed to contain the chaos. Yet the journey itself became a scene of further peril, as mobs intercepted the transport, the presence of uniformed authority offering neither protection nor assurance of safety. This mass arrest reflected the deep-seated inequities in the city's power structures. Those who had acted in defense of their lives and communities were treated as criminals, while perpetrators of the broader violence were largely left unchallenged, creating an environment where justice was inverted and fear dictated both action and policy. The arrests, the shootouts, and the subsequent confrontations revealed a stark reality about Atlanta at the time. The line between self-preservation and criminality was defined not by morality or intent but by race. In communities that had long suffered under systemic oppression, the decision to resist was fraught with danger. Yet it was also a profound assertion of dignity and humanity. Families watched as fathers, brothers, and sons were seized, uncertain whether they would ever return, while those who had remained at home or fled witnessed the consequences of asserting a right to defend oneself in a city that had normalized racialized violence. The events highlighted both the courage of the black community and the systemic failures that allowed mobs to roam freely, while punishing those who dared to protect themselves. This period also illuminated the broader social and political currents that had brought Atlanta to this breaking point. The violence was not merely spontaneous. It was fueled by months of sensationalized media reports, racialized political campaigns, and long-standing economic and social resentments. Newspapers had spread stories casting black men as threats. Politicians had used fear to consolidate power, and whites who felt their dominance challenged by demographic shifts and economic competition responded with collective aggression. In this context, the armed resistance of black residents was both a reaction to immediate threats and a symbolic stand against decades of systemic inequality and targeted oppression. The consequences of the shootout and the mass arrests were profound. The removal of over 250 black men from their communities left gaps in households and neighborhoods, exacerbating the trauma and dislocation caused by the earlier waves of violence. Yet, these events also served as a testament to resilience, showing that even in the face of overwhelming power and institutional bias, individuals and communities could assert agency, protect their families, and resist the forces that sought to suppress them. The courage displayed in these moments became part of the historical memory of Atlanta, a reminder that survival often demanded both bravery and sacrifice, and that standing against injustice could come at a steep personal cost. As the city slowly returned to a semblance of order, the legacy of the armed resistance lingered, shaping how communities remembered those days of terror and informing future generations about the importance of self-protection, solidarity, and resilience in the face of systemic threats. The story of the shootout and mass arrests underscores the complexities of defending one's community under oppressive conditions, illustrating both the extraordinary lengths to which ordinary people went to protect themselves and the broader societal failures that made such measures necessary. It serves as a powerful reminder of the human capacity for courage, the devastating consequences of prejudice and mob violence, and the enduring need for justice, equity, and accountability in any society striving for true safety and dignity for all its members. As the chaos of Atlanta's streets reached its fevered peak during those fateful days of September 1906, one of the most harrowing truths became evident. The very institutions that were meant to maintain order and protect citizens instead often amplified the danger, leaving black residents vulnerable to unchecked violence and, in some cases, making them direct targets. Throughout the city, law enforcement and militia units were present, yet their presence did not equate to safety. On the contrary, many officers either looked the other way as mobs roamed freely, carrying out assaults on families, businesses, and individuals, or they participated actively in acts of brutality themselves. For those who had hoped that uniforms symbolized protection and authority, the reality was a bitter betrayal. Citizens who had trusted in the promise of civic safety found themselves navigating streets where danger was amplified rather than mitigated, where the line between lawful authority and lethal threat had been horrifyingly blurred. The failures of law enforcement manifested in multiple ways. In some cases, officers failed to intervene even when witnessing assaults on the most vulnerable, allowing mobs to pull black men, women, and children from streetcars, beat them with clubs, and commit acts of violence with impunity. Witness accounts describe police standing nearby as victims were chased, struck, or worse, their silence serving as tacit approval. The distinction between mob and authority collapsed as the same uniformed figures, who should have acted as shields against violence, instead became instruments of fear, their presence often signaling the expansion of chaos rather than its containment. Black residents quickly learned that the streets they once traversed freely were no longer governed by the rules of protection and law, but by the whims of racialized terror that had infiltrated even the structures of official oversight. Worse still, there were documented instances where police and militia forces directly engaged in lethal acts against black citizens. On Randolph Street, for example, 2 men, Will Morin and James Fletcher, were shot by city officers who claimed that the men had fired at passing white individuals, a claim that was never corroborated. These killings exemplified how law enforcement could manipulate the narrative to justify actions that reinforced the dominance of the white mob, casting black residents as aggressors when, in truth, they were defending themselves or simply present in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each of these acts of sanctioned violence served as a chilling reminder that authority, rather than safeguarding life, had been weaponized against those most in need of protection, cementing fear as a pervasive and constant reality for black Atlantans during and after the riot. The complicity of militia units further complicated the situation. Sent to ostensibly restore order and quell unrest, these armed groups sometimes acted with the same biases that had fueled the mobs, interpreting the defensive actions of black residents as provocations rather than as legitimate self-protection. Communities that had armed themselves to resist attacks found their neighbors being arrested en masse or assaulted in the streets, demonstrating a system where the act of defense was punished more harshly than the acts of aggression that had prompted it. The result was a profound sense of injustice, as black citizens realized that their survival depended not only on courage and quick thinking but on navigating a landscape where the very instruments of law could be as deadly as the mobs they were intended to suppress. The impact of these failures extended beyond the immediate violence, reshaping the social fabric of the city in ways that would reverberate for generations. Families who had relied on police protection found themselves isolated, forced to seek refuge in churches, homes, and other private spaces where they could shield themselves from both mob and authority. Entire neighborhoods experienced heightened vulnerability, with residents observing and recounting the complicity of officers as part of the historical record, a testimony to the systemic nature of racial injustice. Even those who survived the direct violence carried with them the psychological scars of knowing that the line between protection and threat was perilously thin, and that authority could be a source of peril rather than safety. Yet, amid this grim reality, acts of courage and resilience emerged, demonstrating the human capacity to resist oppression even when the systems designed to uphold justice fail. Black leaders organized relief efforts, coordinated safe havens, and worked tirelessly to support victims, showing that community solidarity could persist even under circumstances where official structures were hostile or negligent. These efforts underscored the duality of the period, a time of extreme vulnerability that also revealed extraordinary fortitude, resourcefulness, and moral courage. Citizens acted not only to protect their own lives but to assert the dignity of their community, creating networks of defense and support that, while unable to completely counteract the violence, provided critical lifelines for survival. The role of police and militia in these events serves as a historical lesson in the dangers of systemic bias, unchecked power, and the abdication of responsibility by institutions entrusted with safeguarding the public. It reveals how authority, when influenced by prejudice and fear, can become a tool of oppression, perpetuating cycles of violence rather than preventing them. For the residents of Atlanta in September 1906, the presence of law enforcement and militia was paradoxical, at once a promise of order and a source of existential threat. Their complicity, negligence, or active participation in violence transformed what should have been protective structures into instruments of terror, shaping the lived experience of a community under siege and leaving an indelible mark on the city's history. Understanding this chapter of Atlanta's past compels reflection on the broader responsibilities of authority, the importance of accountability, and the need for systemic reforms that ensure protection is universal rather than selective. It emphasizes that safety and justice are not inherent in uniforms or institutions but must be actively enacted through ethical practices, vigilance, and a commitment to equality. The events of 1906 remind us that when systems fail, ordinary citizens often bear the heaviest burdens, highlighting both the vulnerabilities created by institutional complicity and the extraordinary resilience of those who endure and resist. Among the harrowing events of those September days in 1906, certain witnesses stood out not only for the vivid recollections they later shared but for the profound ways in which the violence shaped their understanding of race, justice, and civic responsibility. Walter White, who was only 13 at the time, experienced the Atlanta chaos from the safety but no less frightening perspective of his family's downtown home. Peering out from the window, he watched streets he had once walked with casual familiarity transform into arenas of terror and destruction, as mobs roamed freely, committing acts of violence against his neighbors and strangers alike. From that vantage point, young Walter saw the harsh realities of racial hatred and mob rule, impressions that would inform his later work as a civil rights leader and eventually as the head of the NAP. The images and sensations of fear, courage, and human suffering he witnessed became formative, instilling in him both a sense of responsibility and a deep understanding of the systemic injustices that had allowed such violence to flourish unchecked. Meanwhile, E.B. Du Bois, already a prominent scholar and thinker, experienced the riot in a manner that combined intellectual observation with personal peril. Aware of the dangers surrounding him and his family, Du Bois took the extraordinary step of arming himself for protection, a choice that underscored the severity of the threat and the reality that conventional measures of safety laws, police, or militia could not be relied upon. In his own home, he secured his family and prepared for the possibility that the violence would encroach upon their doorstep, a scenario that, tragically, was all too plausible given the indiscriminate targeting of black residents across Atlanta. This act of defensive preparedness reflected both Du Bois's pragmatism and the broader theme of the community's reliance on self-protection when societal structures failed them. His dual role as observer and participant in these events offered him a unique vantage point. He could analyze the social, political, and economic forces at play while simultaneously confronting the immediate threat to his loved ones. The experiences of White and Du Bois also illustrate the spectrum of responses among black Atlantans during the riot, from passive observation to active self-defense, highlighting the diverse strategies employed to survive amid chaos. Young and old, scholar and laborer alike were forced to navigate a city transformed into a hostile and unpredictable environment, where every streetcar ride, every journey downtown, and every encounter with armed mobs carried potential danger. Witnessing such extreme circumstances through the eyes of these two individuals adds a deeply human dimension to the historical record, allowing modern audiences to appreciate both the immediacy of the terror and the longer-term implications for those who lived through it. Their experiences also underscore the profound psychological impact of the riot, revealing how exposure to systemic violence can shape a lifetime of activism. Scholarship and leadership. Walter White's observations, filtered through the lens of a teenager grappling with fear and confusion, provide an intimate perspective on the human cost of the violence. From his window, he could see neighbors fleeing, streets littered with debris, and the grim toll of the attacks on families and businesses alike. These sights, etched into memory, became more than mere recollections. They were lessons in resilience, vigilance, and the necessity of confronting injustice. Later, in his civil rights work, White would draw upon these formative experiences, using his understanding of mob violence and systemic racism to advocate for federal protections, anti-lynching legislation, and social reforms designed to prevent such atrocities from recurring. In this sense, the riot was not only a moment of immediate danger, but also a crucible in which future leaders were forged. Du Bois, similarly, internalized the lessons of those September days. His decision to arm himself, while rooted in the practical need for family safety, also symbolized a broader acknowledgement that moral argument and societal norms were insufficient shields against prejudice-fueled violence. Through his writings and activism, Du Bois would later convey the urgency of addressing structural inequities, illustrating how first-hand experience of systemic oppression can catalyze both intellectual inquiry and political engagement. His observations of the riot, including the failures of law enforcement and the complicity of local authorities, informed his lifelong critique of American social and political systems and his advocacy for black self-determination. Education and civil rights. Together, the experiences of Walter White and E.B. Du Bois encapsulate the duality of witnessing and surviving terror. One can be simultaneously a vulnerable observer and an active participant in the struggle for safety, agency, and justice. Their stories serve as a powerful testament to the resilience of the black community in Atlanta, highlighting both the personal courage required to navigate immediate threats and the long-term vision necessary to combat systemic oppression. The memories forged during those 4 days of chaos would resonate far beyond the streets of 1906 Atlanta, influencing national conversations about race, justice, and the responsibilities of both individuals and institutions in the face of injustice, and providing enduring lessons on the interplay between personal experience and societal change. By examining their perspectives, we gain insight not only into the events of the riot itself, but also into the formation of a generation of leaders who would confront injustice with both courage and intellect. Their lives demonstrate how exposure to violence and inequity can ignite a commitment to advocacy and reform, showing that even in moments of extreme danger, the human capacity for foresight, strategic thinking, and moral action persists, offering hope that lessons learned through hardship can inform a more just and equitable future. The aftermath of the September 1906 violence left Atlanta's black community in a state of profound devastation. The physical destruction of homes and businesses only mirrored by the psychological and social scars that would endure for generations. As the smoke cleared and the streets began to return to an uneasy calm, the reality of what had transpired became painfully clear. Families had been torn apart. Neighborhoods devastated, and the economic foundation painstakingly built by black entrepreneurs was shattered almost overnight. Barbershops, restaurants, laundries, and other businesses that had represented both financial independence and community pride were reduced to rubble. Their owners left with the daunting task of rebuilding in the shadow of both material loss and the ever-present threat of racial violence. The destruction was not merely a series of isolated incidents, but a coordinated assault that struck at the heart of a thriving and ambitious community, signaling that prosperity alone could make one a target and that success carried the heavy burden of envy, fear, and hatred from the dominant social order. The broader implications of the riot extended far beyond individual loss, shaping the political and social landscape of Atlanta in ways that would reverberate for decades. In the wake of the violence, measures were taken that systematically disenfranchised black citizens, particularly in the realm of voting rights, where restrictive policies and discriminatory practices began to take firmer hold. By 1908, the combination of fear, intimidation, and legislative barriers had significantly reduced black political influence, eroding the gains made during Reconstruction and leaving the community increasingly vulnerable to further marginalization. The riot, in effect, served as both a literal and symbolic precursor to the entrenchment of Jim Crow laws, codifying racial segregation and cementing a social hierarchy that sought to maintain white supremacy through both legal structures and cultural norms. For Black Atlantans, the violent upheaval was more than a moment of terror. It was a stark demonstration of how social and political systems could be weaponized to suppress progress, curtail freedoms, and perpetuate inequality under the guise of restoring order. Economic repercussions were equally profound. The destruction of black-owned businesses not only deprived families of income and stability, but also disrupted the circulation of wealth within the community, undermining opportunities for growth and investment that had taken years to cultivate. Merchants, artisans, and laborers alike faced the dual challenges of repairing physical damage and navigating a climate of fear that made everyday commerce fraught with risk. This economic disruption reinforced social hierarchies, as white-owned enterprises continued to thrive unscathed, creating a stark contrast between the devastation suffered by black residents and the relative security of their white counterparts. The riot, therefore, functioned as both a literal and symbolic reinforcement of economic inequality, demonstrating how violence and intimidation could be strategically used to maintain existing power structures while stifling the aspirations of a community striving for self-sufficiency and dignity. Beyond material and political consequences, the emotional and psychological impact on Atlanta's black population was immense. Survivors of the riot were left grappling with grief, trauma, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability that shaped everyday life long after the mobs had dispersed. Families mourned loved ones who had been killed, while children, teenagers, and adults alike carried the memory of violence as a constant reminder of the fragility of their security and the capriciousness of justice. Neighborhoods that had once been sites of community solidarity and pride became haunted spaces, their streets marked by loss and fear, their residents wary of venturing into public spaces without caution. The riot, in this sense, was not merely an event but a defining moment that reframed the lived reality of a city, shaping the collective consciousness of a generation and imprinting lessons about both resilience and systemic oppression. At the same time, the resilience of the black community began to emerge in response to these hardships. Amid the rubble and fear, leaders and ordinary citizens alike organized relief efforts, coordinated rebuilding projects, and worked to preserve what remained of their economic and social institutions. Churches, social clubs, and informal networks of mutual aid became critical hubs of support, offering not only material assistance but also moral reinforcement and strategic guidance for navigating a hostile environment. These acts of solidarity, while insufficient to undo the extensive damage, reflected a profound determination to endure, adapt, and protect the community's identity in the face of systemic and targeted aggression. Through these efforts, the riot's aftermath became a testament not only to the destructive capacity of racialized violence, but also to the enduring strength, ingenuity, and perseverance of those who survived it. The legacy of the 1906 Atlanta events thus encompasses both tragedy and instruction. The riot revealed how economic competition, political empowerment, and demographic growth could provoke violent backlash in a racially stratified society. and it illustrated the mechanisms by which law, media, and social norms could be manipulated to reinforce systemic oppression. Yet, within the devastation, there emerged enduring lessons about the power of community resilience, the necessity of vigilance in protecting rights and livelihoods, and the enduring human capacity to rebuild, resist, and assert dignity against overwhelming odds. In understanding the impact of the riot on Atlanta's Black community, we confront both a stark historical warning and an enduring narrative of courage, reminding us that the consequences of injustice extend far beyond the immediate moment, and that the fight for equality requires both awareness of history and commitment to a more just and equitable future. As we reflect on the harrowing events that unfolded in Atlanta in September 1906, it becomes increasingly clear that what transpired was not merely a moment of spontaneous violence, but a stark manifestation of systemic racism deeply woven into the fabric of society. The massacre exposed the ways in which fear, prejudice, and the desire to maintain social hierarchies could be manipulated through both media and politics to devastating effect. Newspapers that were meant to inform and enlighten instead became instruments of misinformation, publishing false reports that vilified Black citizens, inflamed public sentiment, and rationalized violence against an entire community. In this manipulation of the truth, we see a chilling lesson in the power of narrative and the consequences of allowing prejudice to dictate the flow of information. A lesson that resonates even in today's world, where media continues to shape public perception and social dynamics. The political climate of the time further underscores the calculated nature of the violence. During the 1906 gubernatorial race, candidates leveraged racial fear-mongering as a strategic tool to secure votes, exploiting anxieties about economic competition, political influence, and demographic change. The machinations of Clark Howell, Hoke Smith, and other political actors were not incidental to the riot. They were intertwined with it, revealing how power structures can weaponize existing prejudices to suppress civic participation and maintain societal control. This orchestrated environment amplified tensions, turning what might have been localized disputes or isolated acts of aggression into a coordinated, citywide campaign of terror against Black Atlantans. The implications are profound, reminding us that political and social systems are only as just as the people who operate them, and that vigilance and accountability are essential to prevent the abuse of authority in any era. Yet, within the devastation, the resilience and courage of the Black community stand as a powerful counterpoint to the forces of hatred and oppression. From young Walter White, who witnessed the violence from his family home, to E.B. Du Bois, who armed himself in the face of imminent danger, and countless unnamed residents who fought to protect their families and neighborhoods. The response of those affected demonstrated remarkable bravery and determination, even in the wake of economic ruin, widespread injury, and personal loss. Members of the community mobilized to rebuild homes, re-establish businesses, and support one another through networks of aid, fellowship, and solidarity. Their actions remind us that human spirit and collective effort can endure even in the face of systemic violence, and that the seeds of justice, equality, and reform are often nurtured in the crucible of adversity. The massacre also serves as a cautionary tale about the fragility of civil rights and the importance of legal protections, social vigilance, and civic engagement. The failure of law enforcement and militia to protect Black citizens, and in many cases their active participation in the violence, highlights the dangers of leaving communities vulnerable to unchecked power. It underscores the necessity of building institutions and legal frameworks that are accountable, equitable, and protective of all citizens, rather than complicit in perpetuating injustice. The events of Atlanta in 1906 echo through history, demonstrating that the struggle for racial equality is ongoing and that the lessons of the past must inform our efforts to create a society in which justice is not conditional, and safety is not determined by the color of one's skin. In examining this tragic chapter, we are reminded that systemic racism is not an abstract concept, but a lived reality, one that manifests in tangible ways through economic suppression, political disenfranchisement, and acts of violence, and that confronting it requires both awareness and action. The massacre illuminates the dangers of silence and complicity, urging us to recognize the mechanisms through which inequality is maintained and to actively participate in the work of social justice. It calls upon us to support initiatives that foster education, equity, and inclusion, to hold media accountable, to demand transparency in politics, and to champion policies that protect the most vulnerable members of society. By internalizing these lessons, we honor the memory of those who suffered and ensure that their experiences are neither forgotten nor repeated. As we close this reflection, I want to sincerely thank you for taking the time to engage with this difficult yet important story. Your attention, curiosity, and willingness to confront the realities of history play a vital role in keeping these lessons alive and ensuring that awareness leads to meaningful action. If you found this story compelling, informative, or moving, please consider supporting our efforts by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with your friends and family. Your engagement helps amplify these narratives, sparking dialogue and understanding that can make a tangible difference in the ongoing pursuit of justice and equality. Finally, as the day draws to a close and we carry these reflections with us, I wish you peace, rest, and rejuvenation. May the lessons of the past guide your actions, inspire your empathy, and deepen your commitment to a more just and compassionate world.